Welcome to this journey into one of Louisiana's most disturbing and deliberately forgotten cases. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now as you listen to this story. Are you at home with the lights on? Walking alone at night? Comment below with your location and the time you're watching. There's something about shared fear that connects us all, and I want to know you're there, listening as we uncover what happened in the shadows of St. Landry Parish. The year was 1889. The Reconstruction era had officially ended 12 years prior, but the South remained a landscape of economic devastation and social transformation. In the rural stretches of Louisiana, where the Bayou Teche winds through moss-draped cypress trees and forgotten cane fields, a different kind of reconstruction was taking place, one built not on progress, but on exploitation, one that would consume a young woman named Marguerite Arceneaux and leave behind questions that remain unanswered to this day. This is not a story with a clean ending. There is no justice waiting at the conclusion of this narrative, no moment where investigators triumphantly solve the mystery. Instead, what we have are fragments, letters that should never have been written, legal documents that read like contracts for livestock, witness testimonies given decades too late. And at the center of it all, a 19-year-old woman who was treated as property, who wrote desperate messages from inside a mansion that became her prison, and who disappeared so completely that even her bones were never found. The case is officially listed in Louisiana State Archives as the Arceneaux-Laveau contractual dispute of 1889. That sterile title does nothing to convey the horror of what actually occurred. It reduces a human tragedy to a financial disagreement, which is perhaps exactly what those in power intended. Because what happened to Marguerite Arceneaux was not a dispute. It was not a contract gone wrong. It was something far darker, something that involved the deliberate trafficking of a vulnerable young woman under the guise of debt collection. The basic facts, as recorded in the parish records, are these. On March 14, 1889, Thomas Arceneaux, a widowed sugarcane farmer, signed an agreement with Edouard Laveau, a prominent banker and landowner. The agreement stated that Arceneaux's daughter, Marguerite, would reside at Laveau's estate until such time as Arceneaux's debt of $4,000 was repaid. The contract used the term collateral of person, a phrase that had been used in indenture agreements, but was by 1889 considered legally and morally reprehensible in most of the United States. But this was rural Louisiana. This was a place where old systems died slowly, where power concentrated in the hands of a few families, and where a young woman's screams could be swallowed by the vastness of the bayou. Marguerite Arceneaux had lived her entire life in near-total isolation. According to census records and later testimonies, she suffered from what witnesses described as fits and episodes of disconnection. Modern researchers believe she may have had epilepsy or perhaps a dissociative disorder. Whatever the medical reality, her condition made her even more vulnerable, even more invisible to a society that already considered women as lesser beings. When she was taken to the Laveau estate on that March morning, neighbors later recalled that she did not speak. She did not cry. She simply stared ahead as she was loaded into the carriage, her few possessions packed into a single trunk. One witness, an elderly woman named Céleste Broussard, would tell her grandson 50 years later that Marguerite's eyes looked already dead, like she knew she wasn't coming back. For the first 2 months, there was silence. Thomas Arceneaux continued working his failing farm. Edouard Laveau continued his banking business, appearing at church every Sunday, dining with the parish priest, conducting himself as a pillar of the community, and Marguerite existed somewhere inside the Laveau mansion, behind its iron gates and curtained windows, in a place the public could not see. Then, in May of 1889, The first letter arrived at the parish post office. It was addressed to Father Philippe Gautier at St. Anne's Catholic Church. The handwriting was shaky, the paper stained with what appeared to be water damage or perhaps tears. And the words written on that paper would set in motion an investigation that would ultimately reveal nothing and everything at once. What that letter contained and what subsequent letters would reveal forms the backbone of this case. But before we read those words, before we descend into the psychological horror that Marguerite documented, we need to understand the world she came from and the world she entered. We need to understand how such a transaction could occur in broad daylight, with legal documentation and with the silent approval of an entire community. Because the most terrifying aspect of this case is not what one man did to one woman. It is what an entire society allowed to happen. To understand how Marguerite Arceneaux could be legally offered as human collateral, we must first understand Louisiana in 1889. The state existed in a peculiar temporal space, caught between the antebellum world that had been destroyed by the Civil War and a modern future that had not yet arrived. The Reconstruction era had officially ended in 1877, withdrawing federal troops and returning power to local white elites. What followed was not progress but regression. St. Landry Parish, where this story takes place, exemplified this regression. Located in south-central Louisiana, the parish had been built on sugarcane cultivation and the enslaved labor that made it profitable. When slavery ended, the economic system collapsed. Plantations failed. Banks foreclosed on properties. And in that vacuum of power and money, new systems of exploitation emerged. The Arceneaux family had never been wealthy. Thomas Arceneaux inherited 40 acres of marginal farmland from his father in 1871. He married Marie Boudreau in 1869, and their only child, Marguerite, was born in 1870. Parish birth records describe her as small and sickly, and church records indicate she was baptized quickly, as the priest feared she might not survive infancy. Marie Arceneaux died in 1882 when Marguerite was 12 years old. The cause of death, recorded in the church registry, was listed as fever, though no more specific diagnosis was provided. After his wife's death, Thomas Arceneaux effectively withdrew from social life. Neighbors described him as increasingly desperate, taking out loans to maintain his farm, making poor decisions in planting cycles, and isolating himself from the community that might have helped him. Marguerite, meanwhile, grew up in near-total seclusion. Medical understanding of neurological conditions in 1880s rural Louisiana was virtually non-existent. What witnesses described as her fits likely occurred without any medical intervention. She was considered by the community to be touched or simple, words that carried both pity and dismissal. She attended no school. She had no friends. Her entire world was the 40-acre farm and the small cabin where she lived with her father. An entry in the journal of Dr. Antoine Duchamp, a traveling physician who visited St. Landry Parish in 1887, provides one of the few contemporary descriptions of Marguerite. He wrote, "Examined the Arceneaux girl at the father's request. She is 17, thin to the point of malnourishment, with dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting chronic sleep disturbance. The father reports episodes where she becomes unresponsive, staring at nothing for minutes at a time. She speaks very little, and when she does, her voice is barely above a whisper. I observe no signs of imbecility or madness, but rather extreme melancholy and withdrawal. Recommended fresh air, sunlight, and social interaction. The father seems unable or unwilling to provide these basic necessities." Dr. Duchamp's recommendation went unheeded. Marguerite continued her isolated existence, caring for her father's household, rarely leaving the property, existing as a ghost even before she physically disappeared. Edouard Laveau, by contrast, represented everything the Arceneaux family was not. He had arrived in St. Landry parish in 1881, already wealthy, already connected. Records indicate he came from New Orleans, though his origins before that remain murky. He purchased the former Delacroix plantation house and its surrounding 300 acres, establishing himself as both a landowner and the primary creditor for failing farmers throughout the parish. The Laveau mansion sat on the banks of Bayou Teche, a three-story structure built in the 1840s in the Greek Revival style common to Louisiana plantations. By 1889, it had fallen into picturesque decay, the white columns graying, the gardens overtaken by wild growth, the surrounding trees dripping with Spanish moss that gave the entire property an atmosphere of Gothic melancholy. Laveau himself was described in contemporary accounts as charming, educated and generous with loans. He attended the right social functions, donated to the church, and presented himself as a benefactor to struggling farmers. But there were whispers. There always are. A letter preserved in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society, written in 1888 by Marguerite Arceneaux, a plantation owner's widow, contains this passage. Monsieur Laveau called again yesterday, offering to purchase the north 40 acres. There is something in his manner that disturbs me. He asks too many questions about my daughters, about their ages and their habits. When I refused his offer, his smile did not reach his eyes. I have instructed the girls not to be alone when he visits. Other fragments of concern appear in various documents. A note in the parish priest's diary mentions concerns raised by parishioners regarding Monsieur Laveau's household staff, particularly the absence of female servants. A letter from a New Orleans banking associate questions Laveau's financial practices, noting irregularities in his accounts that suggest income from sources not disclosed. But these were whispers, fragments, concerns that never coalesced into action. Laveau had power, money, and social standing. Those who might have challenged him lacked all three. Into this dynamic stumbled Thomas Arceneaux. By late 1888, he owed Laveau nearly $4,000, accumulated through a series of loans taken to purchase seed, equipment, and supplies that never yielded the returns Arceneaux had hoped for. In December of that year, Laveau demanded repayment. Arceneaux had no money. He had no collateral beyond his failing farm, which was worth less than the debt. According to later testimony given by Arceneaux himself during the brief investigation of 1890, Laveau made the suggestion. He said that in the old days, before the war, such arrangements were common, that a man's family could work off a debt through service. He said Marguerite could stay at his house, help with housekeeping, and that her labor would count against what I owed. He said she would be treated well. He said she would be safer there than on a failing farm. The contract was drawn up by Laveau's personal attorney, a man named Julien Thibodeau, who would later die under suspicious circumstances in 1891. The language of the contract was deliberately archaic, referencing indenture practices from the colonial era. It specified that Marguerite would reside at the Laveau estate until such time as the debt was satisfied through household labor valued at $1 per week. At that rate, Marguerite would need to work for Thomas Arceneaux's debt for 77 years. Thomas Arceneaux signed the contract on March 12, 1889. 2 days later, Marguerite was delivered to the Laveau mansion. The last time her father saw her, according to his testimony, she was standing in the doorway of the mansion, looking back at him. He said her expression was blank. He said she didn't wave goodbye. He would never see her again. For 2 months, silence enveloped the Laveau estate. This itself was not unusual. The mansion sat isolated on its 300-acre property, separated from the nearest neighbors by dense woods and the winding bayou. Laveau employed no local staff, instead bringing servants from New Orleans, individuals with no ties to the community who kept to themselves during their infrequent visits to town. Thomas Arceneaux, consumed by shame and perhaps willful ignorance, did not visit his daughter. He later claimed that Laveau had told him visits were not permitted during the adjustment period and that Marguerite needed time to acclimate to her new situation. He accepted this explanation without protest, continuing his solitary life on his failing farm. But on May the 16th, 1889, Father Philippe Gautier received the first letter. The envelope was unmarked except for the priest's name, written in an unsteady hand. It had been left at the post office with no indication of who had delivered it. When Father Gautier opened it that evening in his rectory, he found 3 pages covered in cramped, desperate handwriting. The letter, which is preserved in the Diocese of Lafayette archives, reads in part, "Father, forgive me, for I am writing in secret, and I fear what will happen if this is discovered. I am at the house of Monsieur Laveau, where I have been since March. I was told I would help with housekeeping, but there is no housekeeping to do. The house is mostly empty, except for the 3rd floor, which I am not permitted to see. I sleep in a room on the 2nd floor that locks from the outside. The windows are nailed shut. I am not alone here. There are other girls. I hear them at night, walking in the hallway, whispering to each other. But I never see them during the day. Monsieur Laveau says they are servants, but they do not act like servants. They act like prisoners like me. He comes to my room every night after dark. He does not hurt me in the way you might think, Father, but what he does is worse. He sits in a chair and asks me questions about my mother, about my episodes, about what I see when I am not myself. He writes down everything I say in a leather book. He asks if I hear voices. He asks if I have ever felt called to do something I cannot explain. He asks if I know things I should not know. Last night he brought one of the other girls to my room. She was younger than me, maybe 15. Her eyes were empty, Father. He made us hold hands, and he watched us and wrote in his book. The girl's hand was so cold. When he finally let her leave, she looked back at me and mouthed words I could not understand. I do not know what he wants from us. I do not know why we are here. Please, Father, you must help. Tell my father I want to come home. Tell him I will do anything. Tell him to forget the money." The letter was not signed, but Father Gautier recognized descriptions of Marguerite from his occasional visits to the Arceneaux farm. The next day, he took the letter to the parish sheriff, a man named Bertrand Leblanc. Sheriff Leblanc's response, documented in parish records, was dismissive. He noted that Marguerite was at the Laveau estate, under a legal contract. He suggested that the letter might be a fabrication or an exaggeration from a girl who was simple-minded and unaccustomed to being away from home. He said that Monsieur Laveau was a respected member of the community and that making accusations against him based on the ramblings of a troubled girl would be inappropriate. Father Gautier pressed the issue. According to his personal diary, he felt a deep unease that I cannot attribute merely to the girl's mental state. There is something in her words that rings true, a terror that cannot be manufactured by someone of her limited faculties. Reluctantly, Sheriff Leblanc agreed to pay a visit to the Laveau estate. On May 20th, 1889, he rode out to the mansion, accompanied by his deputy, Claude Fontenot. Their official report, filed that same day, describes a brief and thoroughly unsatisfactory encounter. Arrived at Laveau property at approximately 10 a.m., were greeted at the door by Monsieur Laveau himself, who was cordial and invited us inside. Explained the purpose of our visit. Monsieur Laveau expressed surprise and concern. He stated that Mademoiselle Arceneaux was indeed residing at his estate as per legal agreement, that she was being well treated, and that any claims to the contrary were the product of her documented mental instability. When asked to speak with Mademoiselle Arceneaux, Monsieur Laveau complied immediately. The girl was brought to the parlor. She appeared clean, adequately fed, and showed no obvious signs of distress or injury. When asked directly if she was being mistreated, she responded in a quiet voice that she was being treated well. When shown the letter, she claimed not to have written it. Monsieur Laveau suggested that the girl sometimes experiences confusion and fabricates memories, which may explain the letter if she did indeed write it in a state of mental disturbance. Finding no evidence of wrongdoing, we concluded our visit. Monsieur Laveau invited us to return at any time should further concerns arise. Father Gautier was not satisfied. In his diary he wrote, "The girl they showed the sheriff was not the girl who wrote that letter. I'm certain of it. There was no recognition in her eyes when I mentioned her father, no emotion at all. She spoke as if reciting words she had been taught. This is not resolution, this is performance." But with the sheriff's official report declaring no wrongdoing, there was nothing more to be done. The matter was considered closed. Thomas Arceneaux, when informed of the letter and the subsequent investigation, said only that his daughter had always been prone to strange imaginings and that he trusted she was being adequately cared for. The second letter arrived in June. This one was delivered to Dr. Antoine Duchamp, the traveling physician who had examined Marguerite 2 years earlier. He was visiting St. Landry parish for his annual rounds when he found it slipped under the door of the boarding house where he was staying. The letter was even more disturbing than the first. It described in fragmentary, disjointed prose what the writer claimed was happening on the 3rd floor of the mansion. Rituals conducted by candlelight, symbols drawn on the floor in ash and blood, girls standing in circles, holding hands, while Laveau read from books written in languages the writer did not recognize. "He is trying to open something," the letter stated. "He says we are special. He says we are doorways. He says through us he can touch something that most men cannot see. I do not want to be a doorway doctor. I want to go home. But home is farther away each night. I can feel myself disappearing." Dr. Duchamp took the letter immediately to Father Gautier. Together, they went to Sheriff Leblanc. Once again, they were told that without concrete evidence of a crime, nothing could be done. Lavau's social standing protected him. The law, as it existed in 1889 St. Landry parish, was not designed to protect young women from men of means. The third letter arrived in July, addressed to no one, found nailed to the door of St. Anne's Church one morning before dawn. It contained only 3 sentences, written in a hand that barely resembled the previous letters, as if the writer's control was deteriorating. "We are 8 now. He needs 3 more to complete the circle. Tell everyone to hide their daughters. Now I want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Is this a serial killer selecting victims, some kind of occult practice, or the delusions of a mentally unstable young woman? Your theories matter because the historical record provides no clear answers, only deepening mysteries. The third letter galvanized the community in a way the previous 2 had not. The explicit mention of multiple girls, the reference to a completing a circle, and the ominous warning about daughters created the kind of panic that social status could not entirely suppress. Parish records show that in late July 1889, at least 6 families with daughters between the ages of 14 and 22 removed them from St. Landry parish, sending them to stay with relatives in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, or even as far as Mobile, Alabama. The official reason given was summer visiting, but the timing was not coincidental. Sheriff Leblanc, facing pressure from prominent families who now feared their own children might be targets, organized a second visit to the Laveau estate. This time, he brought not just his deputy but also Father Gautier, Dr. Duchamp, and 2 additional men, landowners with social standing comparable to Lavau's. They arrived unannounced on the morning of July 28, 1889. What they found would be documented in multiple conflicting accounts, each person present later providing testimony that agreed on basic facts but diverged wildly on interpretation and detail. The gates to the Laveau property stood open, unusual for an estate that typically maintained strict privacy. As they rode up the oak-lined drive, they noted an absence of any sound, no birds, no movement of workers in the fields, nothing but an oppressive silence that several witnesses later described as unnatural. The front door of the mansion was unlocked. They entered without announcement. The interior of the house, according to all accounts, was immaculate. Furniture stood perfectly arranged, floors gleamed with fresh polish, and not a single item appeared out of place. But the house was empty. No servants, no signs of recent occupation, no indication that anyone lived there at all. They searched the first floor and found nothing but pristine, unused rooms. The second floor revealed the same eerie perfection. It was Dr. Duchamp who noticed that one of the bedroom doors had a lock on the outside, a detail that matched the description in Marguerite's first letter. Inside that room, they found evidence that someone had recently lived there. The bed was unmade, a small trunk containing women's clothing sat in the corner, and on the writing desk lay several sheets of paper covered in handwriting. Father Gautier immediately identified it as the same hand from the letters. But these pages were not letters. They were fragments, disjointed observations, phrases that suggested a mind under tremendous stress. Tuesday, I think, but I have lost count. He brought the new girl last night. She cried the whole time. He was angry about the crying. He said, "Crying interferes with the resonance. I don't know what resonance means, but I pretend to understand, because when we don't understand, he keeps us awake longer. The thing in the ceiling is getting louder. At first I thought it was rats, but rats don't whisper." I asked Mary about it. Mary is the one from Point Coupé, but Mary says she doesn't hear anything anymore. Mary's eyes have changed. They're darker now. She smiles at times when nothing is funny. He says we're almost ready. He says the convergence is coming. He drew the symbol on my arm with ink that won't wash off. It burns sometimes. All of us have the symbol now. When we hold hands in the circle, the burning gets worse but also feels good, which frightens me more than the pain. I dream about the water. In my dreams, I walk into Bayou Teche and keep walking until the water closes over my head, and I can't tell if it's a dream or a memory or something that hasn't happened yet. The search party proceeded to the third floor. Here, finally, they found something that shook even the most skeptical among them. The third floor consisted of a single large room, apparently created by removing the interior walls. The space was approximately 40 feet by 30 feet, with high ceilings and windows that had been painted black from the inside. In the center of the floor, drawn in what appeared to be ash mixed with some darker substance, was a large circle, approximately 12 feet in diameter. Within the circle were symbols that none of the witnesses could identify, geometric patterns interlaced with what Dr. Duchamp later described as letters from no alphabet I have ever seen, arranged in ways that hurt to look at directly. Around the circle were positioned 11 chairs. Scattered on and around these chairs were items of women's clothing, a torn petticoat, a single shoe, a ribbon that had been used to tie back hair, small personal effects that suggested multiple individuals had been present in this room. But most disturbing were the walls. Every surface of the third-floor room, from floor to ceiling, was covered in handwriting. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of lines of text, written in multiple hands, overlapping and intersecting. Some passages were in English, others in French, still others in what appeared to be Latin or perhaps something older. Father Gautier, who could read Latin, identified fragments, biblical verses, but altered, inverted, rewritten to change their meaning. passages that appeared to be from medieval grimoires, texts on summoning and binding, and interspersed throughout were desperate personal pleas. "Mother, please, I want to come home. It's been 40 days, I think I'm not sure anymore. He says I'm number 7, and after 11 comes the door. My name is Elizabeth Bro. I am 16 years old. I am from Opelousas. Please remember I existed." Sheriff LeBlanc ordered the entire 3rd floor sealed. The ash circle was left undisturbed, but documented as thoroughly as 1889 technology, allowed, with measurements taken and a few samples collected. The writings on the wall were deemed too extensive to fully transcribe. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Edouard Laveau on charges of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. A wider search of the property was organized, and the families of every missing girl in St. Landry Parish and surrounding areas were contacted to see if the clothing items could be identified. The expanded search of the Laveau estate began on July 29th and continued for 6 days. What they found painted a picture of careful, methodical horror that had been occurring for years. In the carriage house, they discovered a false wall behind which was hidden a small room containing meticulous records. Ledgers listed names, dates, physical descriptions, and notations in Laveau's handwriting. The entries went back to 1883, 2 years after Laveau had arrived in St. Landry Parish. The first entry read, "Marie-Claire Dupuis, 17, Pointe-Coupée Parish. Acquired. Through father's debt. Responded poorly to initial preparation, unsuitable for the work, disposed of in the North Bayou, November 1883. The word disposed appeared multiple times throughout the ledgers. In total, the records referenced 23 different names. Not all entries indicated disposal. Some noted escaped, others proved resilient, and a handful were marked currently in development. Under the main house, accessed through a concealed door in the cellar, they found a sub-basement that had been dug out sometime after the house's original construction. The space was divided into 3 small cells, each approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, with iron bars and locks on the doors. 2 of the cells were empty. The third contained a straw mattress, a bucket, and scratches on the stone wall that formed words. Claire Hébert, March to July 1888. He said I wasn't strong enough. He said I couldn't hold the doorway open. He said he would find better vessels. The search of the grounds proved even more disturbing. On the 3rd day, one of the search party's dogs became fixated on an area near the bayou's edge, where the property's formal gardens deteriorated into wild swamp. They began digging. 3 feet down, they found human remains. The body was that of a young woman buried in a plain cotton dress. Decomposition made identification difficult, but Dr. Duchamp estimated she had been dead for several years. Most notably, her hands were clasped together, and when they separated the skeletal fingers, they found a small piece of paper that had somehow survived the wet soil. On it was written, "Her name was Anne-Marie. She was kind to me. Remember her." Over the next 3 days, they found 6 more burial sites in the same area. All were shallow graves, all contained the remains of young women, and several contained similar paper notes with names and brief epitaphs, as if someone had been trying to preserve the memory of the dead. One note read, "Suzanne, who sang hymns at night to keep us from being afraid." Another, "Josephine, who promised we would escape together. I'm sorry I survived." The autopsies performed by Dr. Duchamp were limited by the state of the remains and the forensic capabilities of the era. He could determine that none showed obvious signs of violence like broken bones or trauma. The cause of death for most remained undetermined, though he noted in his report, "In 3 of the deceased, I observed abnormalities in the throat structure, suggesting prolonged screaming or strangulation, though I cannot be certain which. The items found with the bodies provided some identification. A locket containing a daguerreotype of a couple who were later identified as the parents of Elizabeth Bro from Opelousas, reported missing in 1887. A ring that was recognized by a family in St. Martinville as belonging to their daughter, who had disappeared in 1885 after their farm had been foreclosed upon. The connections became clear. Nearly all the victims came from families in financial distress. All had fathers who had taken loans from Laveau, and in each case, the daughter had either been offered as collateral or had disappeared shortly after the family's financial situation became desperate. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came on the 6th day of searching, when workers clearing brush near the bayou found what appeared to be a small boat dock, hidden from view by careful cultivation of undergrowth. Tied to the dock was a flat-bottomed boat. In the boat they found rope, chains, weights, and a leather satchel containing a sheaf of papers. These papers appeared to be instructions, written in Laveau's hand, detailing what he called the Protocol for Unsuccessful Vessels. The document described in clinical detail how to weight a body for bayou disposal, which areas of Bayou Teche had sufficient depth and current to prevent discovery, and how to ensure that no traces remained. One particularly chilling passage stated, "The bayou accepts all offerings with indifference. It is important to remember that the vessels who prove unsuitable are not failures of the work itself, but merely individuals who lacked the necessary resonance." Each disposal brings us closer to identifying the ideal characteristics. Sentiment is the enemy of progress. The search also produced more mundane but equally damning evidence. Receipts for purchases of rope and chains. Correspondence with contacts in New Orleans inquiring about young women of suitable sensitivity and isolation. A half-dozen books on occult practices, mesmerism, and what appeared to be attempts to combine spiritualist beliefs with more ancient ritualistic traditions. But the man himself remained missing. Edouard Laveau had vanished. The timeline would later be reconstructed with reasonable certainty. On the night of July 27th, approximately 12 hours before the search party's arrival, witnesses in the nearby town of Washington reported seeing a carriage departing from the direction of the Laveau estate, traveling at high speed toward the north. A dock worker in Simmersport, 30 miles upriver, reported seeing a man matching Laveau's description board, a steamboat headed toward Natchez on July 28th. But when authorities in Natchez were contacted, no record of Laveau's arrival could be confirmed. Tracking his movements became a frustrating exercise in near misses and uncertain sightings. A banker in Vicksburg claimed Laveau had withdrawn funds from an account on August 2nd. A hotel clerk in Memphis reported a guest using the name Edward Laval, who checked in on August 5th and departed after one night. A ticket agent in Cairo, Illinois, thought he might have sold a train ticket to a man of Laveau's description, but could not be certain. The trail went cold somewhere in the Midwest. Federal marshals were brought in, given that Laveau had crossed state lines. Wanted posters were distributed throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and as far north as Missouri and Illinois. The poster described Laveau as approximately 45 years of age, 5 feet 10 inches tall, dark hair graying at the temples, well-dressed, speaks French and English fluently, maybe using false names, wanted for kidnapping and murder. But Edouard Laveau seemed to have dissolved into the vastness of America like smoke. What made the manhunt more complicated was the discovery in late August that Edouard Laveau might itself have been a false identity. Investigators attempting to trace his background in New Orleans found contradictory records. A man named Edouard Laveau had indeed lived in the French Quarter from 1878 to 1881, but parish records from that period described him as a coffee merchant in his 60s. That man had died in 1880. The Edouard Laveau, who arrived in St. Landry Parish in 1881, appeared in no census records before that date. His banking credentials, when checked with institutions in New Orleans, were found to be legitimate but recently established. His letters of reference came from individuals who either could not be located or, in 2 cases, turned out to be dead before the letters were supposedly written. Who was this man? Where did he come from? And perhaps most disturbingly, was this the first time he had done this? Investigators began looking at unsolved disappearances in other parishes, other states. A pattern emerged, though maddeningly incomplete. In Ascension Parish in 1877, 3 young women had disappeared over the course of a year, all from families in debt to a banker named Edward Duval. In Natchitoches in 1875, similar disappearances correlated with the presence of a landowner named Edouard Devereux. The names were different, but the pattern was identical. A wealthy man arrives, offers loans to desperate farmers, and young women from indebted families disappear. Then, before any investigation can coalesce, the man himself vanishes, leaving only fragments of a false identity behind. How many times had he done this? How many victims were there beyond the 23 names in his ledgers? But while investigators chased ghosts of Edouard Laveau's past, the question that haunted the community was more immediate. Where were the surviving girls? The ledgers referenced 23 names. 7 bodies had been found on the property. That left 16 unaccounted for. Some entries were marked disposed, suggesting more bodies might be hidden elsewhere, possibly in the bayou where they would never be recovered. But other entries suggested some girls might still be alive. The entry for Marguerite Arceneaux read, "Arrived March 14th, 1889. Shows strong resonance. Episodes of disconnection align with lunar phases. Responds well to the protocol. Currently in active development. High potential for the work." No mention of disposal. No indication of death. The entry ended there in mid-sentence, as if Laveau had been interrupted while writing. Where was Marguerite? Searches of the bayou, the surrounding swamps, and the roads leading away from the estate produced nothing. It was as if she, along with any other surviving girls, had simply ceased to exist the moment Laveau fled. Thomas Arceneaux, when questioned, could provide no useful information. He had last seen his daughter on March 14th. He had not visited her. He had not received any communication from her, except through the priest's intervention. When pressed about whether he had any idea where she might go, he simply stared ahead and said, "Marguerite never went anywhere. She didn't know anywhere but the farm." One investigator's note from this period, preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, captures the frustration. "We have a crime scene that reveals systematic horror over multiple years. We have bodies that prove murder. We have a perpetrator who may not even be who he claimed to be. And we have victims who are simply gone, dissolved into the landscape like morning fog. What do you call a case where everything is evidence and nothing is proof?" The formal investigation continued through the fall of 1889, but by November it had effectively stalled. The U.S. Marshals could not locate Laveau. The bodies found on the property were buried, some identified and returned to families, others remaining nameless. The Laveau mansion stood empty, too tainted by horror for anyone to purchase or occupy. And as winter approached, something else began to happen, something that would add a new dimension to an already incomprehensible case. The sightings began. The first reported sighting came in December 1889, just 5 months after the discovery of the horrors at the Laveau estate. A trapper named Alcide Comeau was checking his lines along Bayou Teche, about 2 miles south of the Laveau property, when he saw a figure standing on the bank in the pre-dawn darkness. He described her as a young woman in a pale dress, soaked through, her long dark hair hanging loose and dripping. She was simply standing there, not moving, staring at the water. When Como called out to her, asking if she needed help, the figure turned to look at him. He later told the sheriff that her face was wrong somehow, like she was looking at me, but also looking through me at something else. Before he could approach, she walked directly into the bayou and disappeared beneath the surface. Como immediately went to the location where she had entered the water. The bayou there was only about 4 feet deep. He could see the bottom clearly in the morning light. There was no body, no disturbance in the mud, no sign that anyone had entered the water at all. Sheriff LeBlanc investigated but found nothing. He attributed the sighting to morning mist and a trapper's imagination. But the sightings did not stop. Over the next decade, at least 23 documented reports were filed with parish authorities of young women seen near the bayou or on the grounds of the abandoned Laveau estate. The descriptions varied, but several details remained consistent. They were always alone. They were always wearing pale, old-fashioned clothing. They never spoke when approached, and they inevitably disappeared before anyone could reach them. A pattern emerged in the dates of the sightings. They clustered around the new moon, and particularly in March, July, and November, the months that appeared most frequently in Lavau's ledgers as times when girls had arrived or disappeared. In 1893, a more substantial discovery occurred. A group of teenagers, daring each other to explore the abandoned Laveau mansion, broke in through a cellar window. They found their way to the 3rd floor, where the circle and writing still remained, untouched since the investigation 4 years earlier. One of the teenagers, a girl named Amélie Boudreau, brought a diary she found hidden behind a loose board in the wall. The diary was brought to Father Gauthier, who had by then become the unofficial keeper of all materials related to the case. The diary was Marguerite's. It contained entries dating from March 14, 1889 through July 26, 1889, the day before Laveau fled. The entries began coherently enough, describing her arrival, her confusion, her fear. But as the weeks progressed, the writing deteriorated, becoming increasingly fragmented and strange. One entry from May read, "He says, I am a doorway. I don't understand what he means, but I feel it sometimes like there is something on the other side of me trying to push through. When we sit in the circle and hold hands, I can feel it stronger. It's not a good feeling, but it's not entirely bad either. It's like being 2 people at once, like there's Marguerite who wants to go home and something else that has no name and no home." An entry from June. "The new girl arrived today. She is very young, maybe 14. She cries constantly. He is frustrated with her. He says crying creates the wrong vibration. I try to comfort her, but when I touch her hand, something passes between us that I can't explain. I see things that aren't my memories, a farm I've never visited, a mother I've never known. Are these her memories or mine? I'm not sure anymore what belongs to me." The final entry, dated July 26, 1889, was the longest and most disturbing. "I understand now what he is trying to do. I understand why he chose us. We are all broken in the same way. All of us see things we shouldn't see, feel things. Others don't feel, exist partially in this world and partially in somewhere else. He calls it resonance. He says we are tuned to frequencies that most humans cannot perceive. Tonight is the convergence. He says all the preparation has been for this. We will sit in the circle, all 11 of us, and we will open the doorway fully. He says on the other side is knowledge that mankind has sought since the beginning. He says we will be remembered forever as the vessels who brought enlightenment. But I have read his books when he leaves them out. I have seen what happens in the rituals he describes. The doorways do not bring enlightenment. They bring something through that should stay on the other side, and the vessels do not survive the opening. I think he knows we cannot survive. I think he has always known. I think we are meant to be sacrifices, not servants. But it is too late now. We are too far gone. I can barely remember what it felt like to be just myself. The others are worse. Mary doesn't speak anymore. Anne moves like she's being controlled by strings. Claire's eyes reflect light like an animal's. If anyone finds this, tell my father I forgive him. Tell him I understand he had no choice. Tell him I am not angry, but also tell him that something is coming through us tonight, and if we fail to contain it, if the doorway opens too wide, then what happens next will not be Laveau's fault alone. It will be ours. The diary ended there. Whatever happened on the night of July 26, 1889, in that third-floor room, no record exists. Laveau fled. Marguerite and the others vanished. The circle remained drawn on the floor, but whether the ritual was completed or interrupted, no one knows. In 1902, Father Gautier died, leaving behind a collection of materials related to the Arceneaux-Laveau case that eventually made its way to the Diocese of Lafayette archives. In his final letter to the bishop, written days before his death, he included this passage: "I have spent 13 years trying to understand what happened at that estate. I have read every occult text I could find, consulted with scholars, and prayed for guidance. I am no closer to understanding, but I believe this. Whatever Laveau attempted, he did not fully succeed. The doorway he tried to open remains partially ajar, and the vessels he used to open it remain trapped in that liminal space, neither fully alive nor fully dead, caught between this world and whatever lies beyond." In 1956, the Laveau mansion was finally demolished. The property was divided and sold to multiple buyers. A modern housing development now stands where the mansion once sat. During the demolition, workers reported finding additional bones beneath the foundation, though no official investigation was conducted. The bones were quietly removed and buried in the paupers section of the parish cemetery. In 1977, a graduate student from LSU named Rebecca Millette attempted to write her master's thesis on the Laveau case. She obtained permission to access the sealed court records that had been closed since 1890. According to her thesis advisor, she spent 3 weeks reviewing the materials in the Lafayette archives, becoming increasingly agitated and withdrawn. On the final day of her research, she left a note saying she could not complete the thesis and that some questions should remain unanswered. When asked to elaborate, she would only say, "The writings on the walls in those photographs. I had them analyzed by a linguist. Some of them aren't in any human language, and some of them were written after the investigation ended, after the house was supposed to be sealed and empty." The most recent incident occurred in 2003. A family who had purchased property that was once part of the Laveau estate reported to police that their 12-year-old daughter had been found sleepwalking in the backyard at 3 a.m., standing in a circle she had drawn with chalk, whispering in French, though she had never studied the language. When they woke her, she said, "Marguerite told me to wait for the others. She says it's almost time. She says the door is still open." The family moved away 3 months later. The Arceneaux-Laveau case remains officially unsolved. Edouard Laveau was never apprehended, and his true identity was never confirmed. Of the 23 names in his ledgers, 7 bodies were found and identified. 4 more were tentatively identified from items found in the graves, and 12 remain completely unaccounted for, including Marguerite Arceneaux. Thomas Arceneaux continued to live on his farm until his death in 1907. According to his neighbors, he never spoke of his daughter after 1889. In his will, he left his property to the Catholic Church with the stipulation that masses be said for Marguerite's soul in perpetuity. Those masses are still performed once per year on March 14th at St. Anne's Church in St. Landry Parish. The case has generated 3 primary theories over the decades, none of which can be definitively proven or disproven. The first theory, held by most contemporary investigators and modern researchers, is that Edouard Laveau was a serial killer who used debt collection as a means to acquire vulnerable victims. The occult elements found on his property were either genuine beliefs that motivated his crimes or elaborate theatrical staging meant to confuse investigators. The victims who were not found in the graves on his property were likely disposed of in Bayou Teche or other waterways where they would never be recovered. The sightings after his disappearance are attributed to local folklore born from collective trauma and guilt. This theory is supported by the physical evidence, the bodies, the ledgers, the systematic method of selecting victims from indebted families. It presents Laveau as a calculating predator who used the social and legal structures of 1880s Louisiana to hide his crimes in plain sight. The surviving victims, in this theory, did not survive at all, but were simply disposed of more completely than the others. The second theory, less common but persistently recurring, is that Laveau was genuine in his occult practices and that the ritual described in Marguerite's diary actually occurred. Proponents of this theory point to the strange consistency of the sightings, the reports of non-human languages in the wall writings, and the behavioral changes reported in the 2003 incident. They suggest that the ritual may have partially succeeded, trapping the victims in some kind of liminal state between life and death. This theory is obviously more speculative and relies on accepting paranormal explanations that cannot be scientifically verified. The third theory, proposed by a few researchers who have deeply studied the case, is perhaps the most disturbing. They suggest that Laveau was not working alone, but was part of a network of individuals conducting similar experiments across the South during the post-Reconstruction period. The similar patterns of disappearances in other parishes under men with similar names but different identities suggests coordination. The fact that Laveau was able to establish a false identity so completely suggests assistance from powerful connections, and the speed with which he disappeared suggests a pre-planned escape route and a support system. In this theory, what happened at the Laveau estate was not an isolated incident, but one node in a larger operation. The goal might have been genuinely occult, or it might have been something more mundane and equally horrific, such as human trafficking disguised as occult activity. The surviving victims in this scenario were taken by other members of the network when Laveau fled, and may have ended up at other locations where similar horrors continued. Each theory has its advocates, each has its holes, and none provides the one thing that the families of the victims most wanted: definitive answers. What we know for certain is this: between 1883 and 1889, at least 7 young women died at the Laveau estate in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. At least 16 more disappeared in circumstances connected to Edouard Laveau. The legal system of the time allowed a man to essentially purchase human beings through debt manipulation, and an entire community looked away until it was far too late. The grounds where the Laveau mansion once stood are ordinary now. Houses with neat lawns, children playing in yards, nothing to suggest the horror that once occurred there. But on certain nights, particularly around the new moon in March, July, or November, residents sometimes report seeing figures in pale clothing standing near the bayou, always alone, always silent, always watching. Whether these are genuine paranormal phenomena, products of suggestion and folklore, or simply the way a traumatized community continues to process an incomprehensible crime, the sightings persist to this day. No one knows the truth. Perhaps no one ever will. Thank you for taking this journey with me into one of Louisiana's darkest and most mysterious cases. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to be notified of future investigations into forgotten horrors. Share your theories in the comments below. Do you think Marguerite is still out there in some form? Was Laveau working alone or part of something larger? And if you could ask one question that would be answered definitively about this case, what would it be? Join our haunted community by engaging with this content, sharing it with others who appreciate historical mysteries, and continuing the conversation that keeps these forgotten victims remembered. Because the worst thing we can do to those who suffered is to forget they existed at all. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly past. It's always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered.